In today's first reading from the book of Acts, notice how there was this kind of dispute that was going on between the Greeks, the Hellenists, and the Jewish Christians, the early Christians. So the dispute was over the fact that the Greeks were saying that their widows were being neglected, whereas the widows of the Israelites, the Jewish people, they were getting food as they should have been. And so they were saying that the distribution of food was unfair. And when we think of any community, there's always going to be some disputes, some conflicts, but sometimes instead of just addressing the conflict, it was kind of acknowledged, okay, maybe they are being neglected. So they appointed the certain individuals that became the first deacons to deal with the distribution of food to everyone in the community. So as we saw in the previous readings, the early Christians lived together, and they sold everything they had and they shared everything in common. And so the ideal was that you took care of everybody. And this is kind of the standard of the church, to be concerned about the well-being of everyone, especially those who are the most neglected, in many ways the most vulnerable. And this is why the church continues to speak out against injustices, for example, against abortion. Right, so to the church is defending the life of the innocent child in the womb, a very vulnerable, position to be in because of the high rate of abortion. So the church speaks out against that, and we are called to join with the church in proclaiming the truths of the sanctity of human life from the very first moment of conception until natural death. Another thing that is becoming more prevalent in today's age, even in our own society, is euthanasia, the assisted suicide and putting to death the elderly, sometimes even against their will or without their knowing it. And in many countries where this has been happening for a period of time, the elderly are actually afraid to go to hospitals because they're afraid they won't come out alive. So it's a terrible thing, and it's being pushed by society, and we as Christians ought to speak out against these things, but it's also important that we make the effort to support the elderly. And maybe we need more organizations to do that. So we've got various organizations in our parish, the Legion of Mary. We have the home visitation group also to support those who are elderly, who are alone, who perhaps need some companionship. Same as with pro-life issues. We have so many pro-life organizations, including things like Rosalie Hall, where young women who perhaps are still in school, maybe even in high school, they're enabled to continue with their education, to have their child, to keep their child, and to be supported throughout the entire process, supported not just psychologically but through friendship, but supported even financially. So we do a tremendous amount to help the neglected, the poor, and this is something that we ourselves need to do also, and we need to look to that. Now, in today's gospel reading, our Lord goes up into the mountain to pray, and it's assumed his disciples go with him, but then he sends them across the sea to Capernaum. Now, it doesn't state that clearly, but why else would they go? And notice that it mentioned that the sea became rough and there was a strong wind blowing. Now, it doesn't indicate it here, but it's kind of implied that the wind was against them. And they had rowed about 5 or 6 kilometers, so they're tired, they're exhausted, it's the middle of the night, and they're battling the waves and the wind, and then all of a sudden Jesus appears on the water. They think it's a ghost. And so our Lord reveals that it is himself. They take him into the boat, and immediately when they take him into the boat reaches the land towards which they were going. In other words, our Lord miraculously made the boat arrive to where they were going. And there's an important lesson here for all of us. And, we struggle in life. And sometimes we struggle with relationships. Sometimes we struggle against our own sinfulness. Sometimes people struggle to make their payments. There's many things that we might struggle with, right? And one thing that we ought to take away from this is God allows us to struggle. In fact, in some sense, we could even say that God permits this struggle for our own good. Because if God were to remove every struggle, every difficulty in our lives, well, we wouldn't have any problems. It would be like heaven here on earth, which he never promised. So our day-to-day lives here on earth is going to entail struggles of one sort or another. It's guaranteed. Now, if we take our Lord into the boat, into ourselves, then that struggle becomes less difficult, less burdensome. It's not to say that we will always overcome the struggle as the gospel passage implies. Sometimes we do. But the point is that once we take our Lord into ourselves, it's so much easier to deal with all those difficulties that we have to deal with. We still have to struggle to a certain extent, but it just becomes so much easier. And this is part of the lesson that our Lord is trying to teach us. Now, you and I, we might say, well, we have our Lord in our lives. We've taken him into ourselves. Why is it that we still struggle why is it still so difficult to face our struggles? And part of the reason is we may not have fully taken him into our souls. In other words, do we have an attitude of love? Do we have an attitude of genuine concern for everyone? Do we really love our enemies, those who persecute us, those who make our lives miserable? If we lack that love, we haven't fully taken our Lord into our lives. When we attain that level of love, in many ways, many of our struggles will stop or they will cease. So, important lesson for us, right? So, we have to struggle in this life. It's guaranteed, one way or another. What is our attitude towards that suffering? And do we really take our Lord into our lives, to every aspect of our lives, especially in regards to how we deal with others, how we deal with the difficulties that our day-to-day lives bring us?